Hello, Daily Bible Readers. This is our day 51 preview of our reading of the New Testament and of Genesis. Today's reading will come from Luke chapter 14 as well as Genesis chapter 37. And so let's begin with our reading from Luke chapter 14. Now, Luke chapter 14 not only holds a unique miracle as compared to the other Gospels, but a miracle that we find nowhere else recorded. In the beginning of Luke chapter 14, we find Jesus healing a man of what's called dropsy. Now, dropsy seems to be a disease of, we might call it a disease of water retention. It would cause great swelling, from what I understand. And so it's not, it wouldn't surprise me if this particular man wasn't we would call him a plant, that the Pharisees had brought him there knowing that his condition would be very evident, and that when Jesus came in on the Sabbath day, he would see this man and have compassion on him. But I love what Jesus does here. He doesn't wait for them. He actually becomes a little bit pointed toward them. He says, "You tell me, is it lawful for a man to heal a man on the Sabbath?" Now, you won't find a law written about that. If for no other reason, there weren't men who could heal other men of diseases like this. There was never been a man like Jesus. There never been a man with this kind of power or ability. Never been the Lord of the Sabbath to come amongst the people and to heal them of their diseases. And so he will heal the man, and then he'll chastise them. Because while there may not be a law that says a man can or cannot heal another man on the Sabbath day, none of these men would have hesitated to pull their donkey out of the ditch if it had fallen on the Sabbath day. He said, and here's something much more precious, a person much more precious than your donkey. And so he continues to, we'll say, push the issue of understanding his power and his authority. He then will talk to them about their high opinion of themselves, we would say. He talks to them about when they go into a particular event or a supper or a wedding feast. Where do you go to sit? Do you go and sit right next to the bride and groom? Do you take the most prestigious position? Or do you sit back and wait to be called forward? Now, these Pharisees, obviously, as the context implies, are putting themselves in a position above others that they haven't earned, of which they're not worthy, because those that are most worthy in the kingdom of Christ are not those that feel like they have a superiority, but those who serve each other. And so he then goes on in verse 15 to talk about a great supper. A great supper where many were called and invited, and many chose not to come. They give excuses. One of them, has some land to go check out, this, that, and the other. I remember a story I heard about excuses one time. Said that a man came over and asked if he could borrow my ladder. My neighbor did. And I told him, no, you can't borrow my ladder because I've got to go take a nap. And he said, what does you taking a nap have to do with me borrowing your ladder? And I said, well, nothing, but, one excuse is as good as another. If the only thing I'm trying to do is get out of truly giving you what it is that you want. Now, in this case, it's not giving Jesus what he wants, but if we want what Jesus has, there's a cost that has to be paid. And it's not a unobtainable cost. It's the cost that every man has, and that is the cost of his own life. Right? Jesus will relate this as taking up your cross, that is putting your life to death. And if you're not willing to pay that cost, then you can't be expected to receive the blessings that come from being a disciple of his. In fact, he will talk about the people who get ready to go to war, people who get ready to build a great tower. If you haven't determined what the cost is before you go in, then you're doomed to fail before you even begin. And Jesus says, I want you to count the cost being my disciple. And if you feel that's worthy, then you have to give everything that it requires. If not, then you're going to mix this world and the other things that you desire along with the kingdom in such a way that you're going to ruin your salt. He talks about salt here in the last two verses, and when it's lost its savor. And I don't know about you, I think from what I can determine, salt itself doesn't exactly become unsalty. Now, if it's mixed in with other things, if you mix in other impurities, other um, non-salt items, we'll call them, into the mix, then eventually it not only becomes not salty, not capable of doing what salt needs to do, but it becomes so worthless. He says it's so worthless you won't even throw it in the dung pile. Okay, that's pretty worthless. And those who try to shortcut or be part-time Christians or part-time disciples of Christ and hold on to the things of the world, well, they've mixed in things to make your salt impure and therefore not of any benefit to Christ, no benefit to the world, no benefit to the dunghill if you've not counted the cost and given your life even to Him completely. These are my thoughts on Luke chapter 14. Now let's turn our attention to Genesis chapter 37. And beginning in chapter 37 of Genesis, our narrative takes a turn away from Jacob somewhat and more toward his son Joseph. Now we're going to see the other sons mentioned, and Jacob will play a role throughout the rest of the book of Genesis, but the majority of the attention in Genesis 37 through the end of the book is going to be placed on Joseph. And we're told that Joseph would tend the flocks with his brothers, and a few interesting thoughts about these some of the verses here in this chapter. One of them in verse 2 particular says he's feeding the flock with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. And you'll notice that Leah is not mentioned in that particular account. And we've already seen where Rachel has died, so obviously she won't be mentioned. There's been no mention of the fact that Leah has passed away, though it is possible. In fact, that when we studied the death of Rachel, I made some comments about her not being mentioned ever again in the book of Genesis and in their life. And I probably need to tell you, Leah's not either. In fact, Leah's not mentioned again until chapter, I think it's 49, where Jacob is talking about the fact that he buried Leah at. And that's the only mention that's made, not of how she died or when she died. And so it's possible the reason that only Zilpah and Bilhah are named here is because perhaps Leah has died at this point also. If not, it may just be that those were the sons that he primarily worked with, not that Leah has to have died at this point. It's also interesting in one of the dreams when the sun and the moon and the stars bow down to before Joseph, that Jacob interprets that dream to be that he being the son, and the stars, of course, being the brothers, but the moon being, he says, in your mother. And I don't know if that's a complete understanding of the dream. Maybe obviously we're talking very symbolic, and so the moon could represent at least the maternal position in the family, because his mother Rachel has already passed away, and so just an interesting thought there to consider how these are related. Also, I don't know exactly how they came to the interpretation of the dreams. Obviously, God is providing the dreams, and we see, because we can look back through history and see what happens, that was the meaning of these dreams. But how Jacob or the brothers or even Joseph comes to know exactly what these dreams mean, we're not told. Now, we will see later that Joseph himself can interpret dreams, but we don't find where Joseph tells these dreams and then tells the interpretation. And so perhaps that's what happens, but I'm unsure. One thing I will note is that as you go through the life of Joseph, and we're going to see all throughout it the phrase, and God was with him, I don't find where God speaks to Joseph through all of this. And so, exactly how God is with him is a bit of a mystery, except for to note that I believe that God is with Joseph because Joseph took God with him. Find Joseph having a high respect, reverent fear for God, and a love for God throughout his life, even and particularly during those difficult times. And so perhaps that's why, because his brothers are going to, of course, take him and throw him into that pit. Reuben, the eldest of the sons, maybe feeling a responsibility because of that, is going to try to make a way to get him out of the pit and get him back. And while he's gone, Judah will come up with the idea of selling him to some Ishmaelites that are coming through. You'll notice also through this narrative, they're called Ishmaelites, they're called Midianites, and in the last instance in verse 30, 36, they're actually referred to as Midianites. So instead of M-I-M-E, Midianites. However, all of these groups, some of this could indicate the area from which they came. Some of them could relate to their lineage. You know, they're obviously from the lineage of Ishmael, who, just to give you a time frame, we're about 150 years after Ishmael was discharged from the presence of Abraham and out of his camp. And so plenty of time for him to have had those sons, and those sons grow into princes and have a family unit of tribes that would be so engaged in this type of activity of going down into Egypt and trading there. But through us all, there's a great deception. And we've seen a lot of deception already in Genesis, and we've seen the results of that deception, where Jacob deceives his brother, and where Jacob is then deceived, and where even Rachel deceives her father. And remember, when we were reading through that, the fact that you're reading it isn't God giving his endorsement of what happened. Rather, it's just a record of the history of these events. But even through all that deception, we see that in the end, God's will is accomplished. Yeah, man can't derail God's plan. They may not act according to the way he would have them to act, but man cannot derail God's plan, particularly when it comes to the fulfillment of his promise through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and to bringing of that seed that should bless all nations of the earth. And so these are my thoughts on Genesis chapter 37. Hope they've been helpful to you. And as always, our prayer is that you allow the Word of God to be a lamp unto your feet and a light unto your path.